Okay, there's a number of things I want to cover in this video, so bear with me. The main issue here, of course, is the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Uh, I'm a little surprised the World Health Organization only described this as a pandemic recently, rather than earlier on when it was already an emergency situation in several countries, which my understanding is the definition of a pandemic. So there is one theory that Chinese government has been putting a lot of pressure on the WHO to kind of not use terminology that might make them look bad. But it's just a theory. It's not entirely substantiated. I wouldn't entirely be surprised by that though. I want to talk about the situation here. Just a quick thing that has nothing to do with the virus, but just kind of adds to the drama of this general situation. Sunderland City Centre today, there was apparently a suspect device found. And the whole city centre, with the exception of Park Lane, if you know the city, was cordoned off. So that's not good. I imagine they have a bomb disposal team down there. It's definitely a strange situation because Sunderland is not exactly a well-known city. I mean, we're not Birmingham, we're not Glasgow, we're not the sort of city that might be a terrorist target. Nevertheless, they weren't taking any precautions, and I tried to do my part, my civic duty, and sort of spread the message, so to speak. The police were clearing people. They'd extended the cordon, so I was sort of going around telling people not to go to that part of the shopping centre because they were only going to be sent back anyway. Um, I also saw some kids messing around, and I'm sure they were trying to wind up a young Chinese guy. So I uh, I kind of verbally confronted them. Been a bit of a dramatic day, yeah. And then all of this going on in the background. So there's two ways that I want to sort of break down this video: the world situation and the situation in this country, which are of course interconnected. But I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of people who say a lot of things about this virus when they're not medical experts, they're not scientists, they're not virologists. I'm not. So everything I'm saying here is simply things that I've seen reported, that I have seen in documentaries. I have done a bit of research on the Spanish flu, but not academic research, just layman's research. And also this one, as I understand it, the I forget the formal term, but the rate of infections to or the rate of deaths rather to those being infected with this virus is 3.4%. With the Spanish flu, it was 2.5%. What that means is 3.4% of all those who contract this will die, which is still quite a low figure when you consider, for example, the death rates of the Black Death. Of course, that was a time when there was a great deal of ignorance about how viruses and so on were spread. Um, but even pandemics in the 20th century or epidemics from a more localized point of view. I think there was something called the Marland virus, or it was something like that. It was in sub-Saharan Africa. It had a very high fatality rate. I think it was something like 80%. So one thing to take away from this is most people who are affected are going to recover. And I do think that is important to stress. Um, Having said that, it's hard to not feel some degree of anxiety with what's happening. I'll be quite honest, I am feeling a little bit more wary of this than I was when I made the video saying that I wasn't overly concerned about it. Now, I haven't changed my fundamental feelings on that. I'm still not overly concerned about the virus itself. I am getting increasingly concerned about some of the social implications. Certainly, the panic buying is an issue because it gets into sort of ethics. You know, there are people buying up because they're worried they're going to run out of food, but obviously There are people who really do need that, vulnerable people, maybe people who have not got access to supermarkets, maybe older people. So I do think we all have a responsibility to be sensible and to only take what we really do need and not really, really stock up. I'll be honest, I have been buying more food than I would usually buy. Um, but the sort of discount food, or rather the sort of products that are more economical, for example, pasta. Pasta's just be it's almost impossible to find right now, dry pasta, because everyone's been buying it. Why? Because pasta's nutritious, pasta can last a while, and pasta's cheap. You can get a packet of pasta for between 20 pence and 55 pence at Tesco's. So everyone's been buying that. Everyone's obviously had the same idea. I've got enough right now, but a week from now, it's going to be very, very hard to find that. Um, I don't want to be overly critical of the government because I don't know how much better they could have handled this. One of my subscribers did ask me in a private message that he felt that the government's covered up certain things. I honestly don't, I haven't given a great deal of thought to that. I don't see any reason why our government would have covered anything up, particularly as the epidemic didn't begin here, the pandemic didn't begin here. I'm not saying the British government isn't capable of it, but I think you have to consider the nature of our society. We have an open press. We have a press that can freely criticize the government. So it would be a lot harder to have the sort of cover up that is has happened in China. So I don't see. I don't. I haven't really been thinking of that. If I'm totally honest. Um, how have they handled it? I think there has been some degree of mixed messages. I mean, Johnson and his medical people were saying just use common sense, wash your hands more often. But some statements are not entirely helpful. For example, he said in the press conference yesterday, we're going to strongly advise people avoid communication with others. Now, others to me is a bit vague. Is that other people in general, or is that people who already have the virus? So I think some of the statements are can be a little bit vague. I do have a lot of sympathy for small businesses because as much as the Chancellor has come out with this incredibly generous budget, you know, the era of cuts and austerity is now formally over. It's apparently the biggest giveaway in inverted commas for a long, long time. These are exceptional circumstances, and the problem, as I understand it, and I may be wrong about this, is that small businesses cannot claim insurance as well. Any businesses can't claim insurance if it's not an imposed situation. So, for example, if they're ordered by the government to shut on pain of penalties, then they can claim insurance. But if it's more just strong advice, which seems to be the case right now, the government is saying we forbid you to go. They're not saying we forbid you to go to restaurants, cinemas, theatres, and so on. They're saying we strongly advise not to. Now, that may be a civil liberty issue, but I know that Italian nationals who are here are saying that we have seen what's happened in our country and they would actually support a more hardline approach. Um, it's impacting everything. I mean, sporting events, football matches, boxing matches, pop concerts, election cycles. I watched the Biden Sanders debate. Of course, they had to change that. They moved it from Phoenix to Atlanta, to the CNN headquarters in Atlanta. Biden and Sanders just bumped elbows rather than shook each other's hands directly. Um, I cannot think of anything that has affected the world in such a sweeping way in every sense than certainly since the Great Recession, possibly even in this country since the Second World War. I really can't think. I mean, certainly during the Troubles, Londoners would have got used to bomb scares and that sort of situation. Certainly, people in Northern Ireland got used to that. I guess in the 70s, the 3 day week shortages, that sort of thing, would have had an effect on everyday life. Um, but I can't think of anything that's had such a sweeping impact nationwide, certainly not in my lifetime, as this. So we all need to be level-headed, I think. I was speaking to a Chinese friend yesterday in the city of Guilin. She's a teacher and she still needs to conduct lessons from home. They're still not going into school. But the situation in China is that the number of cases has drastically decreased. They only had 13 new cases yesterday, which is a hugely reduced figure from the early stages. Now that makes me think, and again, I am no expert, but as China was the source of this, maybe they have actually been through the worst. Notwithstanding the fact 3,000 people have died there, maybe China has seen the worst and they're now sort of in that post, whether it be herd immunity, although my friend was skeptical that that's the issue in China. But regardless, whatever the situation is, the number of new cases has decreased. Now, I do not trust the Chinese government at all. I still think there are very real grievances or very real contentions as to their cover up in the beginning, in the early weeks. I've heard people try to condone that. This isn't just about China. This has had a direct influence on the rest of the world. And whilst it's true that there's new cases have developed in people that had no connection to China, that hadn't been to China, hadn't been in touch with people who had. So I am not saying the Chinese government is to blame for the entire crisis, but I do think they are to blame for the spread because if they hadn't covered up in those early weeks, I think it could have been contained to Wuhan or at least Hubei province. I don't think it would have spread across the country. It may have done, who knows? It may still have happened. But the lack of transparency, this is a direct consequence of Chinese totalitarianism having implications beyond Chinese borders. Um, I also fear that this may actually be used as an excuse by authoritarian governments to justify their draconian policies that were already in place before this crisis broke out. That's the point of concern. I have heard some sources say that we should sue the Chinese government. I'm not sure that's the best approach at this particular moment, but I do think one thing we should absolutely do is robustly challenge and condemn the Chinese regime's attempt to blame anyone else. For example, by spreading false rumors that the American military put a biological weapon in Wuhan. It's complete nonsense. Even if you do go down that line, the United States has no military presence in China, so it would be very practically difficult, even with the technology the United States has. And then you get into the whole realm of espionage. Okay, if you want to go down that line, why would that aid America? Because China's the world's second biggest economy, so launching biological war against China to create a health pandemic in China won't help the United States or Western countries because it's a worldwide pandemic. So I do not I do not even humor that theory. But I do think it's right that I understand in the States the Chinese ambassador was summoned to for him to be remonstrated over these comments. And I think if they try to level similar accusations against the UK or try to scapegoat the West in any way, we need to summon the ambassador and say, tone it down. Because there has unfortunately been some racist incidents against Chinese nationals, but the Chinese regime is not above jingoism of its own. I mean, only this week they have decided to expel all journalists of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Not exactly a great way to show that they're being transparent, by taking that sort of sweeping approach to outside journalists. So I say China constantly demands respect, but respect is a two-way street. And I agree with what Sanders said. Now is not the time for punitive punishment, but nevertheless, we need to recognize what China is doing. And if China thinks, or if the Chinese regime and Xi Jinping think now is the time to be saying, oh, we don't want to lose face, so let's try and scapegoat others. Now is the time to basically rein in on the Chinese regime and say, look at yourselves, look at the way you've responded to this. It doesn't matter what good you've done in the previous months, your initial response is a problem. That lack of transparency is a problem. The lack of a free media in China is a problem. And any Chinese nationals who defend their government cannot complain about being treated, people taking issue with that. If you're Chinese and you're going to other countries only to defend the communist regime, don't complain. Do not complain. The rest of the world is sick and tired of the attitude that the Chinese communist regime has, demanding respect but not showing any. So it's not, I'm not saying that this crisis should be used as a way to bash China, um, but it should be used as an example or an eye opener to show the nature of the Chinese regime. The only thing they care about is saving face and power. That's it. Um, People can praise what they have done in recent months, but the fact of the matter remains, in those early weeks, they tried to cover it up. It's irrefutable. And even most Chinese are well aware of that, although they won't admit it to foreigners. Um, so, yes, racism against individual Chinese is completely wrong. I've heard cases of people of East Asian appearance being attacked, and it's definitely racially motivated because, the odds of throwing coronavirus at them as a slur, it's, you know, just common sense that that is the background of those sort of assaults. But I do not think that this is the time for the Chinese government to be playing the victim and to be demanding respect. For once, they need to be obliged to show some humility, accept that they got some of this wrong. Are they responsible for the entire thing? Probably not. I would accept that there are, the way pandemics move, I guess you have these second phases and so on. Again, I stress I'm not speaking as an expert. I don't pretend to be an expert. Medical people are the people to talk about the precise circumstances of this. However, I do know the nature of the Chinese government, and I think it's an important thing. Regarding the situation in the UK, it's going to be some hard months ahead. And with Brexit on top of all of this, with the negotiations in this sort of transition period, that just, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to have implications one way or the other. Maybe it will have very little influence. I don't know. But um, it couldn't come at a more complex time. I mean, what a baptism this decade has had. Um, I think in the UK situation, people need to not be selfish. They need to stop panic buying on bulk. I support stores, making rules on that because it's just selfish. I don't blame people for taking precautions and maybe buying a bit more than they would usually get. I've been doing that myself. But the thing is, if you're buying up face masks or sanitizers, all you're doing is preventing other people from getting it, which means that you're not being protected because then they could get the virus. It's just, that's one thing that does concern me about all of this. I also do somewhat fear the economic consequences. If it leads to another global recession, which is a very real possibility. With that comes political extremes. You get social tensions, and we've already seen some indication of that happening. So my feelings right now is quite mixed. I'm not losing sleep over it, but I'm perhaps a little more wary than I was a few weeks ago, if I'm totally honest. I would also say that I don't want to say good, but there may actually be some side effects of this that are welcome in a sense. For example, it's going to be good for the planet. I mean, Extinction Rebellion will be pleased about this because with far fewer cars on the roads, with far fewer planes in the air, etc., it's going to be good for the planet, actually, in that sense. And I don't think that's a flippant statement. I think if you look at the reduced pollution in China, you look at the reduced cars out there, etc., the reduced CO2, generally that is not a bad thing. It's a bit like the Great Fire of London wiped out the bubonic plague in 1666. Um, so sometimes you get good coming out of bad. It will also mean people will appreciate things maybe they didn't before. Maybe they will appreciate um, time together more. Maybe they will appreciate taking on board little things in a way they didn't before. We were all rushed about life before. Um, for me personally, I work from home technically at the moment, so it's not such. Me personally, I don't have major restrictions. I've got plenty of food at the moment. I've got everything I need. So I personally, I'm young, I'm healthy, so I'm not overly concerned from my point of view. I'm a little concerned about the country though, and I am a little concerned about the implications for the world. I mean, a recession that does concern me somewhat. Um, what else can be said? This thing is going to get worse in this country, and I think the real issue is how we deal with it. Do we lose our minds and get ridiculous and end up fighting in the streets like with Black Friday sales, like that sort of situation, or do we just use common sense, wash our hands more, stay indoors if we have the virus, just I guess use common sense, touching your face. That's easier said than done. Um, I can't think of anything like this that's had such a sweeping global sort of situation implication. But I do think, okay, I was critical of the Chinese government to start off with, but I do think we need to be quite assertive with how they are, the sort of rhetoric they're using. And I do think that we need to be taking quite a hard line there. I'm not talking about against ordinary Chinese, but even the slightest sign that the Chinese government tries to blame the British government in any way, for example, for policies that were taken regarding flights from China. I know they've said, oh, we warn the West not to overreact. We warn the West? A bit less of the warning, I think, from Beijing would be good. Um, the thing is, the Chinese communist regime is an incredibly arrogant regime. It has no humility whatsoever. It's never had humility because it's a cultural thing as well. They don't want to lose face. But rather than being pushed around the Chinese demands, now it's the time to be saying, "This is how we're approaching it. You don't like that tough. Show some humility. Accept you are largely to blame for the spread of this. You may not be to blame for the whole thing, but certainly this is a very appropriate time to talk about the lack of transparency in China. I know some people, including some Westerners, have praised some of the things the Chinese government has been doing, but I still say whatever good they have done in terms of practical measures doesn't justify that initial cover up. Just doesn't. And they're going to respond the same way with every crisis. This comes down to a fundamental issue about the dishonesty of totalitarian regimes, and it's disgusting, quite honestly. They smeared Dr. Lee until they realized he was right. They smeared him as a troublemaker, as spreading rumors. That does make me angry, and it makes me angry that they have the audacity to even try to blame America or Britain or any other country for this. Um, and like I say, Chinese nationals, they should not be targeted. They are not responsible for what's happened in Wuhan in any way. That's ridiculous. However, if they're going to defend the government in other countries, they cannot expect people to treat that with respect. Okay, so if you're a Chinese national and you're getting defensive and you say, "Oh, bias Western media, my government's done the right thing," I say, firstly, look at the facts, look at how it initially responded, and secondly, do not demand respect when you're in other countries. You need to earn respect, or at least you need to understand that it's a two-way street. So I totally condemn any sort of racist generalizations of Chinese people or racist assaults on ordinary Chinese. It's awful. But I do think now is the time to be absolutely not tolerating Chinese nationalism, or nationalism. That's just, it's an example of where we do need to be more assertive in the West. And I will say this, whilst I think Trump's handling of this has been pretty far from impressive, basically his flippant narcissism, his dismissing of the facts, is I think the way he's handled it for the most part has been pretty woeful. That having been said, I think the Democrats would be wrong to try and say, for example, restrictions on flights from China is some sort of jingoism, or Pompeo and Pence taking a hard line on Chinese human rights abuses, or the lack of transparency, that's somehow American jingoism. The Democrats know full well if Joe Biden becomes president, he too will have to take a strong line on China. So they need to not play politics on this. In my opinion, when it comes to China, there needs to be a united front. That's why I think this country, it's a disgrace that we are polarizing ourselves from the other Five Eyes countries. It's, our allies in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the United States have expressed concerns, not only over the Huawei deal, but just generally our overtures to Beijing. And I don't think the Johnson administration has given much confidence in their anything other than being pushed around. And I am very unhappy about that. The Chinese regime are bullies. That's what they are. Um, I have no respect for them, and I see what they're trying to do. They're trying to export the nationalism. They're trying to push the narrative that Western media is out to get China. Um, so I do think we need to be looking at how they have treated these journalists. Um, because they will do the same thing to BBC journalists, Sky News journalists at some point. So it disgusts me actually. I use that word, that we allow CGTN to operate in this country. Now you may think, oh, Nathan, this has got nothing to do with COVID-19. Not directly, but it does all come down to Chinese totalitarianism. As for how this government's dealing with it, there's debates around that. I would also say that Richard Branson, so much for his socialist youth days. Virgin Atlantic has laid off staff up to 8 weeks, not laid off, but they're asking them to take 8 weeks off without pay. Now, Branson's vast fortune, he could personally pay these 8,000 employees, personally. So I really do take a dim view of that and think McDonnell was right to raise this in the debate earlier with Rishi Sunak. You see the cynical side of human nature when the super rich behave this way. Um, and it is an aspect of conservatism I don't like, that conservatives are far less likely to stand up to that sort of situation. But anyway, I digress. So, a few conclusions. In this country, we need to just take the precautions. We need to be sensible. I don't want to get it, but if I do get it, I will isolate. I'll follow the advice. I understand it's like a fever. It's not going to be fun, but the recovery rate is very high. So at least there's that to consider. I do have concerns for people with older relatives, vulnerable relatives. My parents are in their 60s. It's on my mind. My youngest sister has serious health problems, so that is certainly on my mind. But that's it really. I'm not saying this all comes down to China. The situation in Italy is very bad, and I do wonder why it got so bad in that country. Iran is bad, South Korea is bad. However, I do think it is relevant to raise these issues about Chinese transparency, Chinese media. I think that's all very relevant to this. And we absolutely should not be kowtowing or apologizing to Beijing right now. If anything, Beijing should be apologizing to the rest of the world for the way they initially covered this up. But they don't have humility. Uh, they only want to save face, so they're never going to do that. I mean, if there was a situation where there was some massive cover up in the United States or in Britain or in France or another Western country, and that directly had an implication for the rest of the world, the rest of the world would be talking about it. So China has no right to play the victim here. And like I say, if they do go ahead and expel Western journalists, we need to respond in kind. I don't see why we should have propagandists for CGTN who are paid up, basically members of the Communist Party, allowed to freely promote their Western phobia here, whilst Western journalists are harassed in China. I think respect is a two-way street, and for too damn long, the West has conceded too much to China. We've given them too much respect. This is a regime that simply cannot be trusted. It's time we woke up and realized what it was.